Our panelists are Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Mr. Harim Watson Peiris, Dr. Towfiqul Islam Khan, Dr. Devendra Kumar, who have already presented on their topics before lunch. From Nepal side, we have Mr. Ajaya Bhadra Khanal. Mr. Ajaya Bhadra Khanal is the director of Ukalu Abhiyan and also the editor-in-chief at ukalu.com. He has also been the General Secretary of Nepal Transition to Peace Institute in the capacity of Executive Director from 2014 to 15 and also worked as the Program Advisor to the Asia Foundation in 2014. Mr. Khanal is also associated with CESIF as a research advisor. His research interests include the issues related to corruption, impunity, geopolitics, and international relations. To moderate this panel, I would like to invite Ambassador Vijay Kant Karna. Ambassador Karna served as ambassador from Nepal to Denmark 2008 to 2012. He is a professor of political science at the Tribhuvan University. He is currently the executive chairperson of Center for Social Inclusion and Federalism. His interests include working for marginalized communities, geopolitics, international relations, and foreign policy. I would like to request all our panelists to please come up on stage.
Hello. Thank you, Ankita. After the lunch, everybody is thinking of some sleepy and something with the rice and mutton. We have so now I hope our panelists from South Asian countries will make it situation in such a way that nobody can allow to sleep. So thank you everyone. Ankita already introduced professors or experts on different countries. So start with India, and we have a very eminent scholar from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Jawaharlal Nehru University in Nepal, everybody knows it. We have a lot of people from JNU and with us, and so Professor started with one very important thing that on BRI, your extensive presentation this morning, that what we found that globally the BRI has been changing from when it started, and now if you see from 18 to 21, 22, the China itself is making the tone down itself, investment is reducing. So in this context, what do you see that the effort made by the Chinese president to creating a new economic order in the world through this that was perceived earlier, but during this COVID and all other things, what do you think that why it was getting like this way?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Thank you for this opportunity once again. Discussing the geopolitics in BRI related. So one is the cooling down in BRI relatively because of various geopolitical developments. Number one is the COVID-19, definitely. It has resulted in, of course, a number of unfortunate deaths all over the world, but also to the reduction in any connectivity projects. Many of them have not got the visas. Many of them working outside have not got the visas to go and work in these BRI projects. I mean, the connectivity issues require a lot of labor migration. There is technical staff, do surveys, etc. Many nations have actually shut down 2020, 2021, 2022. These 3 years nearly we have not had much movement aviation industry is shut down. Um, all cross-border movements have all been shut down, and so there is obviously a problem here for the BRI from the COVID-19 related. But of course, there is the vaccine movement and aid programs and others, which has created a little bit of support for people around the countries. China did contribute nearly 80 million doses of vaccines, but like in China, the effectiveness of these vaccines was actually problematic. So it actually led to image problem for China. And now the surge in COVID cases in China is creating a lot of other problems in addition to the vaccine related issues. The Brazilians found 56% effectiveness in Sinopharma, which means 44% you're not sure whether you're going to get the virus infection. So this is one problem. The second problem is Ukrainian conflict from February 24th this year. This has created havoc in the energy, fuel, fertilizer, in these three issues, and Eurasian region, that is the focus of the BRI. Remember, Xi Jinping inaugurated the BRI in Nazarbayev University in Astana in September 2013, and in October he went to the Indonesian Senate to inaugurate the Maritime Silk Road, which is the second component of the BRI. So these were affected, especially the Eurasian region was affected with the Ukrainian conflict. And the Chinese used to send freight volumes to Europe, Poland, Belgrade, Romania, Hungary, and other countries. So a total of, I think, 6,000 trains were taken, and $450 million worth of goods has been transported to Europe through these freight trains that carried a lot of these HP computers or others. And then when they got back from Europe to China, they hardly had anything to carry, so they were carrying vegetables, wine, whatever that the European countries were able to produce, because much of the European industry has shifted towards towards China. So the second factor, Ukrainian crisis, resulted in a relative decline in the BRI, especially the continental route of the BRI, especially Moscow, Mongolia, the routes towards the Middle East, Iran, and of course the Afghan crisis as well has resulted in the toning down of the BRI. However, there is now Xi Jinping wants to revive the BRI, and so let us see next year if there is a summit level meeting, and because the Chinese are also flexible. Remember, in the first BRI meeting they said unilateral. This is a Chinese initiative. In the second summit meeting they said this is a multilateral initiative. So they made a mid-course correction for the BRI. So which means in the third summit probably they will say some other issues which may be useful for many of our countries.
Professor, in this context, if I recall, President Xi Jinping in September 2021, he has a new initiative like GDI, GSI and other initiative. So along with the BRI, how the China is able to go with the security initiative, and there is another initiative which is less talk with the global health initiative also. After this COVID they have made it. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Shangri-La dialogue, he has been little bit explained about all this initiative. So you don't think that due to some failure or some Due to this BRI, the China has a new initiative in this path.
It is still not clear what exactly the GSI, GDI are, Global Security Initiative and Global Developmental Initiative. If you look at since the 1980s, the Chinese have been floating several concepts. First was the keeping a low profile by Deng Xiaoping in 1989. In 90s, they floated a concept called New Security Concept. And then later on in 2002, they proposed Peaceful Rise of China. And then it was modified into Peace and Development. Because Malaysians, Indonesians complained that their automobile industry will be gobbled up by the Chinese automobile industry. So the peaceful rise has been transformed into peace and development. Semantics are also important here, but the Chinese have the habit of changing many of these. And then again, when Xi Jinping took over, he mentioned about China Dream, China Rejuvenation, and socialism with Chinese characteristics under the new era, and other initiatives. Now we have a new concept, that is the Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. They have not defined exactly, except for 6-7 components of the GSI. So in GSI, again, they mentioned about what is there in the new security concept, that is mutual trust, win-win cooperation, and I'm forgetting the third. The same thing has been repeated in the GSI, Global Security Initiative. So there is a lot of repackaging. Like many of the projects that before came under normal infrastructure projects, they're all now grouped under the BRI. If you have seen from 2013, many of these projects have been renamed as BRI projects. Likewise, the GSI also included a lot of concepts that Chinese have been floating for long, for the last 10-15 years. So in this light, what we can say is GSI is also going to be transitory, although this is a global security initiative. Previously, BRI is only in the 6 areas. Now, global security is a global initiative. So, in the light of China becoming second largest economy in the world, now they are $19 trillion GDP, and so now they have their sights are at the global level, not at simply regional Asian, South Asian, but at the global level. And that is the problem also for the US to address, because US is the global hegemon, and now China is saying they want to be the challenger to this hegemon and replace the US. So that is where we saw the decoupling during the Trump administration, the tariff wars, and various other measures that they have undertaken in South China Sea. That is the FONOPS, freedom of navigation and overflight operations, on Taiwan Straits, on various other TPSA, Tibet Policy Support Act by Trump administration, in order to address the 15th Dalai Lama related issue. So in the light of all this, the Chinese came out with the GSI and GDI to include the BRI related projects. We will get probably more clarity soon on the GDI, but on GSI, 6 components were mentioned by Xi Jinping in the POA Forum meeting this April. So in this meeting, there was the mention about the Pacific Ocean. Wang Yi went to Solomon Islands, and they started training the police in law and order related issues. So this is a component that we are going to see in the rest of BRI or other initiatives that China is going to undertake. As in the previous session, Dr. Devendra Singh mentioned about the security agencies. Pakistan rejected a Chinese security agency, but probably in future they have no other go except to include the Chinese police stations or others. Likewise, in other countries in future, we will probably see such footfalls increasing, the Chinese police systems, security agencies, and others. So one is Solomon Island law and order related. Second is the Horn of Africa that I just mentioned. Third, new multilateralism like the CEEC plus 17, the Central and East European multilateral organization, which China is now heading, with the East European countries, Central European countries. So this is another initiative. Then there is the CELAC with the Latin American countries. CELAC, I'm forgetting the full form, but so their sites are global in nature, and so this BRI probably will be repackaged in future to address the new changes that have come about.
Thank you, Professor. I will come back to you. Dr. Towfiq. This morning you have mentioned the BRI and other relation between Bangladesh. So when we see that there are some challenges between China and Bangladesh, even the implementation of the BRI projects, issues of EIA, labor components, locals and Chinese workers conflict in some places, and we have also said that some labor law violations during all these project implementation. And even the question of river pollution and other challenges they are facing. So how actually when I look at the projects selected by the Bangladesh under BRI, a huge number, almost more than 40 projects been selected. So how all these projects are, and what we see that after 18 or 19, there is less investment in the BRI projects from China and Bangladesh also. And then recently you have one very good controversy about the Padma Bridge. So can you elaborate a little bit all these aspects of the Bangladesh and China on BRI?
Thank you. No, in general, let me first give you the disclaimer. One of the challenges we have in Bangladesh is to implement our public infrastructure project in a timely manner. So this is not only true for the Chinese supported project, or it is true for in general our public investment project. So we point two terms. One is time overrun. So the projects are not being implemented in a timely manner. The second one we coin is the cost overrun, and it is to some extent linked with time overrun, because when you cannot implement the project within time, the cost also increases. So you need revisions and the cost increases. But that is not the only component. So this is a general, I think, institutional weakness in our public investment project implementation aspect. One of the other concerns that we had, and this is also to some extent leads to some Bangladesh's general challenge as well, is the estimations of the costs can be sometimes overestimated, or it is costlier. So if you look into the international databases, so you will see that building an infrastructure such as roads or rail or flyover is much costlier in Bangladesh compared to any other country in the world, be it China, be it India, be it probably Nepal, and also if you compare it with the European countries. So we are one of the, costliest country in terms of infrastructure projects. So this is quite significant, and when you have more flexibility in what we have in our BRI project, this can be a problematic aspect. So the good governance in public infrastructure is a very critical aspect when we consider Bangladesh. The second question that you asked in terms of that, and this flexibility brings along with some of the loose ends in terms of project quality. Not only that is where it comes to the environmental aspect, and that is why I'm saying that environmental viability and social viabilities are important. The other aspect that you have mentioned is on the labor, negotiation in terms of labor ratio and how we use it. Bangladesh is a labor surplus country, and we are the most densely populated country in the whole world. And I mention this quite often, that our population density is more than 1200 per kilometer. So it's quite high. I see no places with population density over 600. So you can imagine how densely populated our country is, and we have a huge surplus labor, growing labor because of the demographic dividend. So it's very difficult to implement those projects if you have a condition that certain amount of cost will be sourced from the country of, say, be it China, be it India, and so that aspect is there. And of course, the labor standards can also be there. One of the issues that we have discussed is the transparency issue. So we do not fully understand what are the clauses and what are terms and conditions in this project. So it is very secretive in manner. Just to, I'm finishing in 15 seconds. But this is also true for other projects as well. And this is a problematic from the southern countries as well. When we try to implement Indian LOC, this problem was very much eminent in our case as well. So the condition of sourcing was very high, and the only thing that you can implement with those money is that you could just buy stuff for Indian cases. So that's why our first Indian LOC and second Indian LOC, it took ages to implement. So I think when this is on the part of the lending countries, that growing economies that want to be superpowers in the global order, they need to think about that if you want to be a superpower, you need to have some flexibility, not only in terms of terms and conditions that serves you, but also serves to the recipient countries, the low income and lower middle income countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Dr. Towfiq. I will back to you. Coming to Mr. Peiris, you. Sri Lanka, from February to till now, has created almost havoc in Nepal. During that time when I met some of minister and talking about the BRI, no, we are not with loan and all that things. So Sri Lanka issue has been created a very fake perception. It's perceived in Nepal as well as other countries that how you lease out the Hambantota port and how your infrastructure projects are overestimation, implementation and all other issues. And investment is very on protected sectors, and some of the issues has been raised. When we look at the Sri Lanka, it's almost 8 billion loan from Sri Lanka, and you have taken a very high interest rate, although there are other agencies like World Bank, ADB and other agencies available for the less than 1% interest was available. So what led to the political leadership to decide on such a costly loan in the infrastructure?
That's a very good question, Ambassador, and I think I will. Probably
Since you are the earlier advisor to the president, and that's why it's a good question for you also in the decision making.
needed to clarify that I was an advisor to a former president and not the president.
Yeah, in that format.
But let me put it this way. It was certainly not in Sri Lanka's national interest to go in for these loans. It's very clear. It's not just the loans. It's a combination of an unfeasible white elephant project funded through extremely high interest rate loans at a cost that is far higher than what would be the fair market value, or if you had competitive bidding for those contracts. I mean, this also has to be, it's not only the interest component of the loan, but the price that you were paying to the Chinese contractors was far greater than if you actually went in for competitive bidding or what such a port is worth. So all three of these. And remember, it wasn't only a port, it was a combination of a port, an airport, a convention center, communications tower, and a whole bunch of other sort of assets. So it was really not in our interest. About the only thing that you could argue was that this was it was in the president's constituency and he wanted to, which was rural, and he wanted to do something. But I think what is widely perceived in Sri Lanka is that there was acute corruption. In other words, while this was not in Sri Lanka's interest to have take these loans and have these projects, that it might very well have been in the interest of the rulers to get this money, and the perception was that right down the line that there was corruption was involved. This is an allegation. It was made at elections in which the then administration that was responsible for this actually lost, so there certainly seemed to have been. And it's also one of the reasons why there is a push from civil society and certain political actors in Sri Lanka for some of the stolen asset recovery programs of the World Bank to actually kick in into some of the financing that has been a part of Sri Lanka's sort of recent experience. And while that has been a call from some of those in the political opposition, the position that Sri Lanka finds itself in now, I think only increases that call for stolen asset recovery. And of course the flip side, which must also be recognized, and I think again, while Sri Lanka's democratic institutions have been fairly quiet relatively, we have to recognize that the other part of the story in Sri Lanka was that the economic collapses became so extreme that for the very first time in Sri Lanka's independent history since from colonialism, which is now over 75 years, you had a democratically, popularly elected president of just 2 years prior, with a significant majority, actually forced out of office through a popular uprising. So I think if I was to just summarize that answer, it was not in Sri Lanka's interest, and probably people perceived that it was just in the interest of the rulers, who were, at least some of them, who were forced out of office.
Dr. Parishi, I have one thing that, as you mentioned, that the people in the street forced the president to leave the country and resign. So do you think that now the foreign policy and issues of all other, this issue, negotiation between other countries, loan and all these things, needs more transparency? Because this foreign policy issue has been, till now, what I found that it is never much discussed in parliament, much discussed in society, and the negotiation held between the two countries' bureaucrats and the politicians. So now the people who challenge all these narratives, all these negotiations, by the people in the street forced this is not the way to run the country, or this is the way why you have taken the loan. That issue was raised during the street protest also. So do you think that this has a bigger challenge for the democratic institutions? One time it was considered as one of the best democratic institutions in the Asia, as Sri Lanka.
I think, Ambassador, you raise a very important question, certainly one that is worth laying out at a seminar like this and for further research. And that is, as China becomes a increasingly important global player in international finance, and particularly as a creditor nation. It is, however, a one-party state that is engaging with societies, even ours in South Asia, that are democracies, with weaknesses, fragile democracies perhaps, but nonetheless multi-party democratic societies. And I think their understanding of popular support, their understanding of the need for popular dialogue, discourse, debate in the policy-making framework is just not, is inadequate because of their own experience. I mean, I think this is something that needs to be explored. It's very clear not only from the situation of Sri Lanka, where clearly the Chinese involvement was tied to the political project of the Rajapaksa political clan. But in other countries as well, when public support is moving away from their chosen person, whether that is Gaddafi in Libya, whether it is Omar Bashir in Sudan, whether it is the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka, China is slow to recognize it. They find it difficult to understand the principle of popular support and public consent, because it is not something that is part of their, has never been part of their dynamic. And part of that, and coupled with that, is the functioning of democratic societies, which do engage to some extent in a much more robust public debate on these issues than clearly exists in China.
Thank you. Now coming to my colleague, Ajaya Bhadra Khanal. Introducing Ajay ji, I would like to mention one thing, that this CESIF, the basic foundation, me and Ajay ji has just started. So he is a founder, pioneer, he invested a lot of energy, time, intellect in building CESIF. So I acknowledge this, and just 6-7 months back he was research director with the CESIF. Still he is advisor to the CESIF and chief editor of Ukalo.com. He has journalistic passion, which we respect much. So with this, Ajay ji, we have been discussing all these issues from 2017-18 about this BRI, China investment, and other foreign policy issues. When I look at the Nepal-China relations, there are some of the issues like Tibet, then Communist Party of Nepal, and these are the basic, and earlier it was from before 2015 and 16, Chinese used to deal with the state mechanism, formal mechanism, but after that what we found that the Chinese foreign policies in Nepal, one of the strong instruments is the Nepalese Communist Party. So why it is the shifting from that? Can you little bit explore about it?
Thank you, Vijay, for your kind comments. And I think this is a very important question, but also a very difficult one. And I think we have to go back to the idea of Xi Jinping's rise and what it means for Nepal. During research, I found that China's approach to Nepal changed significantly after Xi Jinping became China's leader. And this idea of building relations with Nepal had something to do with the idea of policy exchange, in the BRI. But going much further back, when Xi Jinping came to Nepal, just a day before his visit, he published a signed article in Nepali media where he outlined his blueprint for Nepal-China relations. It was basically a 4-point idea where he said, he categorized them under deepen strategic communication was the first one, broaden practical cooperation, expand people-to-people exchanges, and enhance security cooperation. But the first one I think is important, and it's not much talked about in Nepal, and in Nepal's case it's I think very important. What does he mean by deepen strategic communication? He explains it as a strategic and long-term perspective which Nepal and China needed to adopt. And this blueprint for our relationship would take bilateral relations to a new height. He wrote, quote, we need to maintain high-level exchanges, enhance political mutual trust, and continue to render mutual support on issues concerning each other's core interests. But more importantly, he said that, we may also have more exchanges and experience sharing on governance and development to deliver greater benefits for our two countries. So the idea here is that Nepal and China needed to cooperate much more on governance as well as on development. So this is one point which again and again comes up during statements by Chinese leaders, including Wang Yi, including Chinese ambassador to Nepal. And I think we have to go back to the psychological profile of Xi Jinping himself. I think he's the first one after Mao Zedong to sort of emphasize the ideological lens through which, the ideological lens of Marxist-Leninism through which he understands the world as well as bilateral relations. So I think that ideology, once again, especially Marxist-Leninist ideology, is very important for Xi Jinping, and it has also become important way in which the Chinese state operates. And that, I think, is a very important factor which has led to a particular way in which China seeks to influence Nepal's governance and development objectives. Of course, there are other strategic objectives. China is interested in weaning Nepal away from influence by India and the West, which is seen as reactionary forces. Xi Jinping, in his own country, is emphasizing purity of the Chinese Communist Party, So basically, he believes that ideological decay would lead to decay of the political party as well as the state. So I think there was a similar feeling that Nepal also needs a kind of a political setup which has ideological purity and can resist the reactionary forces, meaning the reactionary forces that are domestic as well as international, meaning the West and the US. So I think we have to understand China's interests in Nepal in the broader context, not only of Chinese foreign policy, but also of its strategy and ideological significance of Marxist-Leninism. So that's just briefly it.
Thank you, Ajay. One very important thing what we observe in this 21 and 22, especially from September 21 to till March and April, we have the three top visits from China. The State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi was here, and then the party's International Department Chief and the People's Congress Speaker. All these top leaders discussed with our political leaders, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and other political party leaders about MCC. And they have a question, always they ask question, why you signed this MCC and what is the challenges you are facing. During MCC ratification, what we found that there is a overall war between USA and China and Nepal. So for me it was a very surprising event that the Chinese and Americans are responding on Nepal each other without the consent of Nepal. And this is first time it happened in the Nepalese history. So what led to this type of finding that discussion on Nepal to two, one emerging superpower and another power? And that and its impact on the domestic, but we found that our political parties in the streets were opposing, and later they supported in parliament. So ratification of MCC became a geopolitical issue during all this course. And Nepal state machinery response was such a very pathetic at the time. So what do you think, what led to this discussion on the international forum?
Again, I think all of us here understand, China's ambitions in the new age. We talked about how by 2049, China seeks to become the preeminent power, not only in the world, but also not only in Asia, but also the world. And I think how China sees Nepal was also seen, for example, I can give an example. 3 months ago, several months ago, in March this year, when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi came to Nepal, he mentioned three things that I think are important. These three things are repeating again and again and again. So the first thing he said was China will support Nepal in finding a development path suited to its national conditions. And that China's friendly policy was open to all parties and party factions and the people of Nepal. So this is the first idea that China encourages all parties in Nepal, all political factions, to explore a governance model. He said he wants all parties and party factions in Nepal to jointly explore a governance model that is conducive to promoting political stability, economic growth, and people's livelihood. So this was his statement to Xinhua. So this was the first point. The second point is, he said China supports Nepal in pursuing independent domestic and foreign policies, by which he means that China wants Nepal to become independent of India and the US West's influence. So this is another major focus of China, that constantly, this refrain repeats again and again. And then the third point is China supports Nepal in furthering participation in the BRI. So I think this idea that the West and India are undermining China's interests, and given China's ambitions to become a preeminent power in Asia and the world by 2049, China is patiently waiting. So one of the reasons why China saw the failure of its policy in Nepal was, the first was COVID, and the second was the political developments, by which government close to China was replaced by a government that was seen as being close to the US and India. So I think China is still biding its time, and there are another several factors which I think in the next decade, it may not be right now, but in the next decade, there are several factors which indicate the possibility that Nepal may once again become closer to China and oppose India and the US. I think if we have time, I will explain those factors later on.
Thank you, Ajay. Dr. Devendra, you have been in China and you just completed your PhD recently. Actually, when we see the India-China relations, there are very interesting one that the China and India's trade is almost more than 100 billion, and it's a big investment by the Chinese in India. At the same time, you have since 2020, you have a lot of border, Taiwan, sometimes in Bhutan, recently in Taiwan. And what we found that these are the issues when we see that there was no reason behind all these border skirmishes, fighting, or the whatever that is. So how you see the Chinese in India regularly in Southeast?
So the economic relations going on simultaneously with the border is which is, I think, the key. We have to understand that when China and India resumed boundary talks and overall relationship in early 80s, the main issue that whether we should resolve border first and then have normal relationship in other aspects. For 8 years, from 1981 to 88 till Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, this issue was not resolved, and in 88 Indian government also decided that okay, let us go ahead with negotiations and the talks on boundary, but we can have also economic relations, and it has had its own regional and global context. Because on the one hand, the Soviet Union and China was they were trying to normalize relations, and then you had the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, which obviously had impact on how effect on Soviet and US and Chinese focus on Pakistan, which led to India somehow accepting that okay, let us have economic relations along with when we are finding a solution to our problem. But we have to understand that while they accepted it till 2012, when last time India and China signed a protocol or an agreement on related to boundary, both things went on quite well. But as I said in the presentation that in the Depsan standoff in 2013, that is the a landmark in a sense. After that, we have a steady deterioration of relations between the two countries, and right now, as of now, it seems that India is India is waiting for Chinese reactions, whether China reduces tensions along the border. If it does not, then how India can respond in economic terms. Obviously, India is taking many initiatives at regional level. For example, you have India-Japan partnership in Asia-Africa corridor, then India's partnership with Russia on building North-South transport corridor and another maritime corridor which was announced in 2019 from Vladivostok to Chennai and many others. And now India is also joined Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and others. So this is the basic. I think now we have to look at how China behaves and what actions India will take.
Thank you, Dr. Devendra. Coming, we have a question and answer session also in this. Professor, one very important thing what we found that recently the G20 meeting in ASEAN summit, during the summit, G20 meeting, the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, they shook hands, they laughed to each other, but they didn't meet the bilateral discussion, we didn't find it. In 2018 and 2019, what we found that the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi became a very good friend, listening Asa Bhosle, Song Si-wan, and South Indian temples, both the leaders were walking on the temple streets. So, what led actually that there were, and that was many articles at the time written that it's the age of Asian countries, both China and India can lead the world and all these things. There were a lot of articles written in Indian paper as well as Chinese and other countries. But now what we found that from 2020 to till now, the less communication at the top levels, and things are that its impact on the Southeast and other countries is bigger one. The geopolitical rivalry is creating some trouble for the small countries like us. And when we read your Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, very openly admitted that there is a problem in the India-China relations. So what actually we are in the small countries, as in the morning I said that we are not capable enough to managing all these superpowers and all. But the impact of all this rivalry, coming to Nepal, coming to Bangladesh, coming to Sri Lanka and all these countries. So do you think that in coming future there is a chances of rapprochement between the two countries?
Thank you. I wanted to come back to another question which was also raised on India-China competition in the South Asian region. Critical areas. I would just highlight one. There are many areas. For example, China has huge capacity build up. They do a lot of dredging projects in South China Sea. Huge capacity. Dr. Khan mentioned about the inability of Indian companies to finish the job on time. This is one factor. all of us will not be able to finish the job because the Chinese have no labor standards, labor laws. If they have to work for 18 hours, they will work for 18 hours, finish the job and get back. That's what the Chinese system is. The Communist Party controls the labor working class, and they lay down the wages, they lay down the conditions in which you work, and you have to finish the job and get back home with that. So there is that flexibility which democratic countries do not have. We have labor laws. You can't have more than 10 hours of labor work in our societies. You have to shut down the shop by 7 p.m. or whatever time. So these are things that we have. But the most crucial, I think, competition is at the 19th Communist Party Congress, the Chinese said that they will export a China model. China model is basically authoritarian model. Communist Party directed, and they have a set of the state-owned enterprise will be the basis for their export model. Secondly, they have also the kind of authoritarian system within this China model. Chiang Weiwei, a former secretary to Deng Xiaoping, he criticized democracies by saying that, see, look at these South Asian democracies, they could not deliver goods to the people, that is economic development, but they transited towards democracy, that is one person, one vote, and participation in the decision-making process of the country. So he criticized by saying, see, look at the Chinese have first created goods and services to the people, they created wealth. Although there is actually a problem with the Chinese economic data, and somebody mentioned in the morning that they have eradicated poverty, which is not true. China did not eradicate poverty. I can go on explaining those things, but this is propaganda. The most important thing is China wants to export this model of development. On the other hand, all South Asian countries are democratic countries. Every other South Asian country had experimented with democracy in various forms. It is only now the Taliban-led Afghanistan which has not declared democratic institutions. Except for Afghanistan, all South Asian countries are democratic. So which means then we have actually a potential conflict between China-led authoritarian model and a South Asian-led democratic model. In this, China influences the democratic model, and that is where I see a major challenge. On the second issue on why Modi-Xi Jinping meetings in Wuhan and Chennai did not result in any major consequences. I think main factor was the Galwan incident in June 2020 when 20 Indian soldiers were killed in this skirmish. They were throwing stones and all sorts of things. Although China spends $220 billion in defense budget, India spends $70 billion. They were throwing stones at each other to resolve the problem. You can imagine how defense budget is of no use when it comes to conflict between India and China. But jokes apart, what is important is we realize that if you sign an agreement with China, China is not going to implement that agreement. We have very precise agreements with China on confidence building measures. For example, we cannot fly closer to the China border about 60 kilometers. We cannot have a military exercise which is closer to the China border for at least 100 kilometers. If anyone wants to, if China or India wants to mobilize more than a brigade strength, that is 5,000 troops strength, we have to report to the other side, take permission, and then conduct that kind of exercise. We also have a CBM which suggests to demilitarization of areas. So, specific protocols were mentioned in 93, 96, 2005, 2013 agreements. None of these agreements China implemented in 2020 June, Galwan incident. we realize that if you sign an agreement with China, China is going to abrogate that agreement. So we are reluctant to sign any agreement with China now, which means we have hit the rock bottom, and that's where the bilateral relations are.
Thank you, Professor. Now I would like to have our distinguished participant to have any questions. So I would like to my friends, colleague to help them.
Very illuminating talk you have delivered. My query is that when I look below the surface, India is not against BRI, it is against CPEC because its involvement of territorial question passing far out to occupy this Kashmir. Because I am looking deeply, why India took heavy loan from AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund, the largest recipient of AIIB, the part of BRI. Why India is interested in the CPEC, not CPEC, but this through Myanmar, from Kunming to Calcutta, they want to corridor. So, when the problem of territory will be solved between India, Pakistan and China, there is prospect of joining India in BRI, and we, as a, between two great neighbors, we would like to see let India and China develop their relationship, and within 10 to 15 years, the railway connection from Kathmandu to Rakshor and Kathmandu to Raswa. Then we can be linked between two great nations and we can turn the 21st century as the Asian century. Don't you see this prospect? This is the my query.
Thank you.
My question to is our Sri Lankan colleague. There's enough literature written on fall back. Let's not say fall back. More the back. PI investment in Sri Lanka. I want to know what public mood like. Is there any appetite for Chinese more, or the public blame is more squarely shifted to the political leadership, which was of course very corrupt, incompetent, or is it combination of both? Thank you.
हाम्रो नेपाली साथीलाई भएकोले नेपालीमै बोले अजय भद्रजीलाई वेलकम फुड इनिसिएटिभ साइन गर्दा नेपाली कङ्ग्रेसकै मन्त्री हुनुहुन्थ्यो भनेर बिहानै पनि सुन्नुहुन्थ्यो सो चाइनासँगको सम्बन्धमा नेपालका पार्टीहरू सबै नै उत्सुक भएर नै अगाडि बढेको हामी देख्छौँ तथापि अहिले डिस्कसनमा हामी सी जिनपिङ आए पछाडि चाहिँ प्योरली कम्युनिस्ट आइडियोलोजीलाई लिएर गयो अथवा जाँदैछ त्यो ट्रेनमा भनेर विश्लेषण गर्नुभएको छ त्यसमा अलिकति अझ क्रिटिकली तपाईँ हाइलाइट गर्न चाहनुहुन्छ कि भन्ने अपेक्षा राख्छु मैले यो किन पनि सोधेँ भने नेपालमा हामी कति प्योरली कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी बाँकी छौँ र चाइना र नेपालको बिचमा केही कम्युनिस्ट आइडियोलोजीले मात्रै सम्बन्ध गाँसिएको भन्ने त्यो एउटा फ्याक्टरलाई मात्रै लिन सक्छौँ त हामी
In this season, I have heard lots about the PCIF corridors. To my knowledge, the PCIF corridor is a dead concept now. In 2019, during the second BRI conference, it is not included in the larger BRI projects. So the Chinese have probably, after going through the intense evaluation, so they have lifted the PCIM corridor due to the opposition from India and other countries, and included the cross-Himalayan multidimensional connectivity network, which go through the Karen to Kathmandu to probably India and Bangladesh. So this is what I want to make a small correction here.
I think BCIM doesn't, is going, are not going to be included as a part of the BRI in the South Asia. Thank you.
Ram Prasad Pandit. We have invited Chinese embassy, and we have also tried to invite some scholar from China with the help of our colleagues, but they refused to join us due to COVID protocol. So that's why we don't have Chinese presence. Thank you.
Talked about discussion between Chinese and Indian side on over Galwan and regularly recurring kind of border conflict. How optimistic are you that this kind of talk that has happened over recent years is it going to help in de-escalating this recurring border conflict, or do you see this just as one of those routine meets that is not going to lead to any substantial long-term settlement?
That is one maritime route, and the second one is land route. Maritime route connects South China Sea to Calcutta, Colombo, and then westward to African Durban as well. And the land route consists from Lhasa to Sigatse, and then it goes west to Pakistan, Iran, and Europe, etc., etc. On the world map, I looked so many maps of the world map, but Nepal is not connected on map, neither the maritime route nor by the land route. My query to all the panelists: why China has not depicted land route from Lhasa to Sigatse to Cairo, Raswagadi, and etc., etc. This is my query. Thank you.
As we are actually changing into a new geopolitical environment, what should be the stand of smaller nations when it comes to connectivity, development? Like now we're talking about BRI. What about other proposals, whether it is P3W, Global Gateway, GDI, GSI that you just discussed about, PGI, IPF? So all of these concepts are coming without transparent financial, without structural, and without a transparent way of fulfilling it. So what do you think in South Asia, I mean, general question that smaller nations should take? Like for example, my view on BRI, should Nepal have signed for projects and implementation of projects rather than signing the geopolitical term? So when it comes to other nations coming into the regions with concepts, what should be the answer for small nations so that we develop, we connect, and we integrate?
Thank you. It's the timekeeper order, and I have to follow. So, coming to Professor, would you like to insert the?
Of course, this has not really taken off because of other geopolitical reasons in the region. So technically, India is partly part of the BRI on the AIIB is concerned. As Dr. Devendra Singh mentioned in his speech, India joined the AIIB because it is market-led. It is based on demand supply. It is based on global financial related issues where we experimented these in IMF, World Bank, ADB or other lending agencies. Based on the project viability, the AIIB also disburses loans or other forms of financial assistance. And so India joined the AIIB because these are financially sound practices. China agreed to these things also to experiment because in the future they also would like to get the institutional experience in handling such issues. Compared to the BRI financing institutions like CDB Exim Bank, CNBC and others, they have also come along and said that they will operate AIIB purely on professional merits. If this project is viable, they will finance this project. So, and they also have the provisions related to recruitment based on global standards in the bank. So, this is the reason why India joined the AIIB, because it is at the global level. European Union joined, Russia joined, many countries have joined the AIIB. So this is the main reason why India joined that. As far as these are market-led, these are financially sound practices, there is that role. BRI doesn't have those, and that's the reason why India did not join. But you are right that there is the CPEC projects, which is the stumbling block in India's posture on the BRI. But let me also say this is also about Asian leadership related issues. BRI at the end of the tunnel wants to place China as number one both in regional order in Asia and the global order. It's like a Marshall Plan that the Americans contemplated in war-ravaged Europe, and so the BRI end product is to place China at a very high pedestal. India does not agree with this. We don't agree that China should be number one in Asia or at the global level. We will work with the US, we will work with European Union, we will work with Japan, which used to be number one in Asia. We will work with all of them to balance China. That is clearly our policy. So we will not join the BRI because it is about leadership issues. It's not about also economic development. It's about leadership issues. And so we will not join that. It's a larger political issue, BRI. So that's on the territorial dispute. We have had 36 rounds of discussions for the past these many years. And we have not found a solution yet between India and China on the territorial dispute. So there are three sectors in which we have not, we have given some of our maps to the Chinese side in the middle sector, but the Chinese have not given their perception of the border to the Indian side. So which means then China is reluctant to resolve this territorial dispute, partly because it's also about what kind of concession that India can make on other issues. For example, on the BRI. For example, even territorial concessions. They want Tawan Tract, which is part of the Arunachal Pradesh. From Tawan, we have a representative who is now the Union Justice Minister. Now, tomorrow he cannot be a Chinese citizen if we transfer Tawan to China. Kiran Rijiju is the Justice Minister, Law Minister of India, Union Law Minister. He was the Minister of State for Home Affairs before. He represents the constituency Tawan, and tomorrow we cannot transfer Tawan. We have elected representatives coming from that region. So there is simply no way, no Indian government can transfer this to China. So which means we have no solution on this. And China is unwilling to. What their main reason is that 6th Dalai Lama in 15th century hails from Tawan. And so their argument is that since the Dalai Lama belongs to Tibet, Tibet belongs to China, so Tawan should belong to China. At that rate, there are so many Tibetans living in Nepal. Imagine what it means.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Towfiq.
I think go back to the question of what this tension between India and the South Asian region means for the smaller economies like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. You see, this is quite unfortunate on our part. I mean, as I see it, I'm much younger than many of you. But South Asia in general is probably the least integrated regions in the whole world, and we should reflect to ourselves why is that. If you look at Africa, if you look at Europe, if you look at Caribbean, if you look at any other places, Africa, there were conflicts and there were disagreements and disputes everywhere, but none of them are in such a impasse that we have in South Asia. We have tensions between India and Pakistan. We can never have an effective start. We have tensions between India and China. We can never have an effective BCIN. Although BCIN, if you consider it, will connect the, I think, lesser developed Indian region and lesser developed Chinese region. If they, the leaders think very carefully, it is the interest of their own country to have a much working economic cooperation in the region. It's not only about Bangladesh and Myanmar, but then again we have Myanmar and Bangladesh as well, the latest tensions in terms of the Rohingya issue. So, to be honest, I don't see a lot of progress in the coming years or decades. I may be too pessimistic. So that is why probably I'm putting much more importance when we talk about small economies, that it is our responsibility to uphold our interests. We cannot consider that our neighbors will actually continue to uphold their false national interests in this region. And unfortunately, we have to rely more on our own
There was the one specific question about public opinion in Sri Lanka now that we have got bankrupted and the financial situation. Short answer to that is that the Chinese, if they have invested in anything as opposed to lending, they have invested in what could be called a small grants program throughout society. There is hardly a Buddhist temple, a trade union, a political party, a politician, or a journalist who has not got some form of assistance from the Chinese. These could be trips to Beijing for education orientation. These could be grants for their different programs. So China has engaged in what you can only call a massive PR campaign in Sri Lanka. And to some extent that's legitimate in the sense that I would at least say that every other country has also tried to do such things. I mean, that other countries have engaged in small grant programs, there are familiarization tours that are done. But no one has come remotely close to doing what the Chinese have done. I mean, everybody else combined does not compare to what they do. They will take 100 journalists to Beijing in one go, which is about half of airplane, whereas other countries might do 5 for the whole year. So as a result of this campaign, which is, you know, I mean, at least they play by the rules, it's open. There is very little criticism of China in Sri Lanka. In fact, it's very difficult to criticize them even in parliament. You will have random members of parliament jumping up to defend them, cross-party. You do not find them criticized in the media. So they are not. Clearly, the projects and its effects are, so for instance, the fact that there are no ships coming to the Hambantota port is mentioned. But the criticism does fall onto the Sri Lankan government and the decision makers who did that, which is also, I think, justified, because clearly the predominant responsibility and the primary responsibility has to lie with the sovereign recipient state that did all of this. And the popular protest was also against the Rajapaksa regime. when you had the protests against the regime, you actually did not see much or any protest, if at all, against China. Now there's localized hostility. For instance, even in the president's own constituency, the fact that large projects take place and a local person cannot get a job in a construction project that is going up, that is visible from his village almost, does cause resentment in surveys and so on. It's like, here is this big thing coming up and, well, I can't get a job there. Now I'm not even allowed to go there. And so you had that localized. Interestingly, the narrative has still been spun. That is, the fault of the government that has structured, which I guess also it is. I mean, there has been no push for local labor and so on, but whether that would have worked. But to answer your question, no, the Chinese have done their work at an enormous scale to ensure that there is almost no criticism of them.
I think I have one question regarding, how to look critically at the relationship between China and the leftist parties in Nepal. Is it too simplistic? That appears to be the question. In order to answer that question, we have to look at several factors. Let's first look at the issue from the Chinese perspective. The first is that China has ambitions to replace the international governance order in favor of China, the international finance system in favor of China, and it is actively promoting development and governance models that's favorable to China and in alignment with China throughout the globe. Especially in Africa, we've seen that developing to a greater extent than in Asia. But in Nepal's case, it is more specific and interesting as well. So another element of China is that by 2049 it wants to become the preeminent power in Asia and the world. And until even 2017, when it published a white paper on security cooperation, it mentioned obviating the need for war or achieving objectives without the need of war. But that position has shifted in the last 4 or 5 years. Now China is prepared for the inevitability of conflict and war. And so its relations with China, with India has shifted because of that. And that is partly because of ideology. And my emphasis on ideology is that since Mao Zedong, this is the first time in China that ideology has become so important, because Xi Jinping sees the world and international relations and the goals of China through an ideological Marxist-Leninist lens, as well as the lens of Chinese nationalism. So that's from the Chinese perspective. So let's look at Nepal's perspective. China has, operated its foreign policy in Nepal, mostly through the monarchy. So that was one single institution, which has shifted now. And Nepal is interested in development, of course, and it thinks that China can provide that kind of benefit for Nepal's development. So that's one aspect which attracts all parties, across the ideological spectrum, whether they are left or right or center. Everybody believes that China can be a good friend and China can be a partner in Nepal's development. But let's also look at what's happening in recent years. First, a lot of Nepali people are beginning to think that democracy is not delivering. Governance is worsening, and we are not able to achieve our development aspirations, economic development aspirations, and people are blaming democracy. So that feeling is growing. Another is, the anti-Indian and anti-Western feeling in Nepal, which is also pushing Nepali people, not only parties, but also Nepali people closer towards China. So although there is this, at the top, the political alignment now favors the West, even Nepali Congress leadership But at the same time, if we look at the larger population base, I think there is greater affinity towards China even now. And given these tendencies, geopolitics, people's dissatisfaction with the West and India, people's dissatisfaction with democracy, and their desire for the visible development aspirations that we see happening in China, there is a possibility at one point that Nepali people will want to become closer to China. And I think, given this situation, China felt in 2018 that this was an opportunity to work together with the leftist forces, which have not only ideological affinity with China, but also nationalist affinity, but also affinity in terms of their aspirations for development. Present appears to be reconsidering its approach, or reflecting on what worked and what did not work. But at the same time, we need to be aware that China is just biding its time, and at one point it will again push for that kind of political realignment, both in terms of ideology, but as well as in terms of bilateral relations.
Just small point.
Yeah.
In addition to what Mr. Kondapalli said, India as such is not against economic project or involvement of any part. I think this. Why BCIM and AIB? You look at India's economic relations with China, right? It's increasing by leaps and bounds. So the issue is not about which country is investing in India, South Asia, because all countries need investment, as does India. The issue is, in addition to territorial sovereignty, the security implications. And why does this arise? I could not explain during my presentation. It's because you have to know what are the security intentions behind the project. So when we see that China is building some project and it sells it as an economic project, but it also has security and military component. So that is not security concern, and that's natural. So the way out of it is that you have to have a transparent initiative, which is why India joined AIP.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the panel. I have nothing to say. That much has been discussed. Only thing I can say that the rivalry between USA and China, we cannot do anything. Even between China and India, our role is limited. But its impact on Nepal, in a small countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Nepal, is obvious there. So we have to try to converge our interests with minimum negative impact on our national interest. So we'll keep our national interest, push them according to our national. It depends on the political leadership and the bureaucratic leadership, that how they deal with these all big powers. So in coming days, we have more challenges in South Asia. Thank you very much, all the panelists, and thank you everyone for participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. We have a short 10 minutes tea break, and if you have any more questions,